Welcome to Ask a Property Manager, episode number 110. Today we're going to be talking about what to do when your tenant just plain disappears. It doesn't happen often, but when it does, do you know what to do? Stay tuned. Over the course of the years, we've had several instances where a tenant will just sort of up and disappear on us. Sometimes we know the reason and sometimes we don't. Typically, the most common reasons that we see for a tenant disappearing are some sort of a serious illness requiring a hospitalization, or maybe like a long-term rehabilitation facility. Tenant does something and finds themselves incarcerated, and unfortunately, sometimes tenants do pass away. It's unfortunate, but it is kind of a natural part of life, obviously, and it doesn't mean that your responsibilities as a landlord stop when the tenant passes away. So we had a question come in via the Rent Prep for Landlords Facebook group. I'm going to go ahead and pull it up on the screen here so you can take a look, and we'll go ahead and read it together. Tenant goes to rehab. What to do? I have a tenant who recently moved in on a month-to-month agreement. I get a call from a friend of his who I have not met. The friend says that the tenant has been checked into rehab and that they want to pick up his belongings. I sent a text to the tenant with no response. I told the friend that I would need to be contacted by the tenant before I let someone else into the property. The tenant had a clean record with good credit, and I have no suspicion that he's a bad person. I'm inclined to help in any way possible, but certainly want to do it in the proper way. Thoughts or experiences? So essentially, what we're doing here is you're dealing with a specific situation, but the advice that I'm going to give here will pretty much apply universally in any type of a situation where you have a tenant that just decides to disappear, whether it be for a rehab, such as in this instance, or even when a tenant passes. We'll kind of cover the full gamut here. There are steps that you need to take to protect yourself as a landlord, as well as to protect the tenant to ensure that you're meeting your legal requirements on your end. I do want to take a minute to mention that different states will have different requirements. So if you are not in New York State, which is where I am, and that's kind of the advice that I'm dispensing here is New York-based advice. But realistically speaking, no matter what state you're in, even if you are here in New York State, definitely run this by a qualified landlord-tenant attorney. I'm not an attorney. I'm a property manager and a real estate broker. I'm not an attorney. Talk to your attorney to make sure that whatever you're doing meets the standard for what the guidelines are in your state. Make sure that you're covering yourself, because by not covering yourself, you really are leaving yourself massively exposed. So step one, the first thing we're going to want to do is restrict access to that unit. We're not giving anyone keys. We're not unlocking the door for anyone. None of that. We're not giving anybody access to that unit. Generally speaking, at the onset of these situations, everything's pretty muddy. You don't necessarily know who's in charge or what's going on. There's a lot more questions than there are answers at the onset of these situations. And until you have clear knowledge as to who's in charge and what gives them the authorization to be in charge, my strong recommendation is that you do not give anybody keys or give anyone access or even unlock the unit for anyone. In this instance, you were contacted by somebody that you've never ever met before. You have no idea if this person is legitimate or not. And that's actually going to lead us into step number 2, which is to call the emergency contact. So when we do our tenant screening, we ask the tenants for 2 emergency contacts that we can reach out to in the event that something happens, we can't reach the tenant or whatever. A situation just like this essentially is why we would want to have emergency contacts. I would go ahead, pull up that rental application, look to see if you have emergency contacts and reach out to them first and foremost. That's who the tenant elected, at least at the time of application, to be their emergency contact. Now, keep in mind that just because someone's listed as an emergency contact does not mean that they automatically get access to the unit. Emergency contacts change over time. You may have somebody that has a significant other when they move into a unit, but then they go through a breakup and that person is no longer who they want making decisions or accessing their unit as their emergency contact. It could even be a family member. I mean, there are plenty of times where people have fallings out with family members that may have been listed as an emergency contact, and then when it comes time for that contact to be used, that family member is not who they want anymore. So just because someone has emergency contacts listed doesn't mean that that person automatically gets access to the unit or anything of that nature. I do strongly recommend that every time you do a lease renewal, you update your emergency contacts as well, so that hopefully when you do need that emergency contact, you do have the most current information available. But really what you're trying to do by reaching out to the emergency contact is just kind of confirming the story. Basically, what you're trying to do is figure out what's going on and start gathering some information, trying to figure out who's in charge and by what authorization, which I'd mentioned earlier. And once you start gathering that information, you're going to be able to kind of figure out what your next step's going to be. The next step typically goes one of two ways. So prior to giving anyone access to the unit, my strong recommendation would be to have that tenant sign off on a release that specifically notes who they want to have access to the unit. This obviously creates big situations in circumstances where the tenant's unable to sign. Maybe they're in a medically induced coma. Maybe they're incarcerated and you can't physically get to the tenant to have them sign that paperwork or whatever the case may be. In that instance, if the tenant can't be reached and can't sign off on something, they need to get some sort of a power of attorney in place for someone to be able to handle their personal affairs, essentially while they're unable to. That's going to be way outside the scope of anything that you're going to be jumping into as their landlord. But when somebody comes back to you and does present that power of attorney paperwork, showing that they're in charge of the tenant's affairs, at least then you're going to know who you can start to work with. And depending on how that power of attorney is written out and what authorizations that person has, you may be able to treat this person almost the same as if they were your tenant. So that would be the recommendation there. If the tenant can't physically sign off on some kind of a release, they need to do whatever they have to get a power of attorney in place so that someone is there to handle their affairs. And all of that is way outside of your responsibility as a landlord or property owner. In the unfortunate event that the tenant has passed away, you're going to be looking for paperwork from the estate of the tenant, and that's going to indicate who the executor or executrix of the estate is. At that point, you can work with the executor to determine who's getting access, settle out any debts, because you may have debt. There may be rent that's accrued, remove any belongings from the property, etc. The power of attorney paperwork or the paperwork for the estate, either one of those is going to be a good indicator as to who's actually in charge and able to act on behalf of the tenant when the tenant can't act on their own behalf. The bottom line here is that you shouldn't be letting anybody into that unit until you can sort out some sort of written, verifiable proof that they have a legal right to be in the unit. Letting somebody into the unit before you have that really just opens you up to a ton of headaches. You know, there's nothing that says that, like, let's use the example we had in the question. This random person walks in and takes $5,000 worth of the tenant's stuff. The tenant comes back from vacation a week later and says, hey, why did you let somebody in my house to take my stuff? You did no verification, you got nothing in writing, and now you're at a loss because of it. Make sure that you're doing what you need to do to protect yourself and to protect your tenants in these instances. Just because somebody appears to be good on the surface, just because somebody walks up and says, hey, I'm here, the tenant said I can go in, just don't do it. Make sure that you have your paperwork lined up, get your stuff in writing, and don't just assume that you're okay to let somebody into a unit. Now, you may be in a situation where the tenant has an unpaid rental balance like we had just mentioned. Most states are still going to make you go through that full formal eviction process, even if the tenant disappeared during their tenancy. Frankly, it's not a bad idea to go through the full eviction process anyway, because then at the end of the day, you know for absolute certain that you have control over the unit. Especially in some states where there, are tenant redemption rights and things like that. Sometimes it's almost worth spending that money. Obviously, it's going to come at a cost, and yes, it's going to come at a headache, but sometimes it's worth it to just know, especially if you have a weird situation like this, that no, I am definitely in control of the unit and can do what I need to do. Now that you have control of the unit again, I want to talk briefly about storage and disposal of the stuff that's left behind in the unit. Again, this is one of those things that's going to vary by state, so make sure that you double check your state laws to find out what the rules and regulations are where you're operating. If you're working with a tenant or a power of attorney, an estate, something along those lines, chances are the items are going to wind up being removed directly from the unit without having to go through the hassle of moving everything to storage. If you're in a situation where there's an unpaid balance and you're working with the estate, they should be settling that balance out before you provide them access to the unit. Also, prior to accessing the unit, I would try to get them to sign some sort of a written agreement, get some kind of an agreement in place that gives you the ability to dispose of everything that's left behind once they've moved out what they're taking. Essentially, treat it like the end of the lease, complete a move-out inspection, dispose of the stuff that gets left behind just the same as you would when a normal tenant moves out. Now, let's say you were never able to actually locate this tenant. You can't find any sort of an estate. This tenant doesn't appear to be around anywhere, just completely fell off the face of the planet. At that point, I would go back through that full that full eviction process that we were talking about earlier, and then move on to clearing the unit out and getting it ready for re-rental. In some states, you're going to have to pay movers to come in and pack everything and move it to a storage unit. You're going to have to pay for the storage unit for a certain period of time before you can dispose of all that stuff. In other states, it's literally set it to the side of the road on the day of the set out, and that's the end of it. You really need to understand what your obligations are under your state law. The bottom line here is to make sure that essentially you cover yourself so that you're not releasing a tenant's information or a tenant's belongings to somebody that shouldn't have those belongings or that information. Make sure that you do have that tenant's permission, and make sure that you're remaining in control of your units whenever possible. Essentially, what you need to do here is be cautious, get it in writing, and don't let anybody push you around. Don't let anybody intimidate you. Don't let anybody force you into doing something that just doesn't sound right. Chances are, if they're trying to push, if they're trying to force, there's a reason that they don't want you to uncover. Thank you all so much for watching. I truly do appreciate it. If you learned something today, do me a favor, hit that like and subscribe button and share this with a friend or family member that could value this information as well. Thank you so much for watching. We'll be back next week with an all-new episode you won't want to miss. We'll talk to you soon.